Ta-da!
All right, everyone. Hi, I'm Diann Shaddox, and welcome to our ET Talks with Jazz Pharmaceuticals. I'm glad everybody can join us, and Dr. Darlene Mayo is a host, and Darlene is going to introduce the participants with Jazz, and she will let you know how this works. We are working to get more information out there for ET and clinical trials. And Dr. Mayo, I'm going to let you take over.
All right. Well, thank you, Diann, for that introduction. And I'm so glad to be co-hosting today. We are so excited to bring you information about the clinical trial going on with Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And so the way the flow is going to work today, very simple. If you are here with us on Zoom, then you're going to be seeing our faces for the first part of the presentation. And then when we get to question and answer, we'll be having that in two portions. So if there were pre-submitted questions, we will go ahead and answer those in a roundtable format. And then we are currently streaming into the Facebook group. So also, if you are in the Facebook group and you have questions and you would like to join us on Zoom, there is a link in the Facebook group. So you can just go ahead and click on that and we will bring you into Zoom as well. You will not come up so you can see your video until the end, but there will be a time at the end after the presentation from Jazz, after we answer the pre-submitted questions, when we will stop streaming to the Facebook group, because what we found is that sometimes it's more comfortable to have discussions where we know we're not streaming to thousands of people. So it will just be the folks backstage, so to speak. Okay, so that's the way the flow is going to look. But let me go ahead and bring up the bios of our friends from Jazz. So first of all, we have Dr. Michelle Bellotti, who joined Jazz Pharmaceuticals in 2015 and is currently the global development lead for JZP-385, which is a T-type calcium channel modulator in development for the treatment of essential tremor. Dr. Bellotti holds a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Texas Health Sciences Center. She has predominantly focused on neuroscience research during her career in the academic and pharmaceutical world. Dr. Bellotti resides in the Clinical Development Neuroscience Group at Jazz and lives in San Francisco, California. In her free time, she enjoys spending time with family, friends, hiking, attending music concerts, traveling, and reading. Welcome, Dr. Bellotti. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Mayo. Hi, everyone.
And we have Dr. Mandy Sturkle, who is a clinical scientist within the Neuroscience Clinical Development Department at Jazz Pharmaceuticals. She holds a PhD in psychology from the West Virginia University and completed her postdoctoral fellowship in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Stanford University. Dr. Sturkle has been at Jazz since 2016 and currently works as the clinical science lead on the JZP-385 Essential Tremor program. Dr. Sturkle lives in San Jose, California, and in her free time, she enjoys running, baking, and spending time with her husband and one-year-old son and puppy dog. So welcome, Dr. Sturkle. We are so glad to have you as well. All right, well, I am going to go ahead.
Wonderful to be here.
Good, good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. I'm going to highlight you here so you can go ahead and share your screen and start that portion of the presentation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Mayo. And as I mentioned, it's extremely exciting to be here. Both Michelle and I have been looking forward to this for quite some time, and I will actually turn this over to Michelle to start the presentation, and she'll give you a more broad overview of the drug development process. And then once she's finished with that portion, she'll turn it back over to me, and I'll get into a little bit more details on our essential tremor trial at Jazz, as well as how we think about designing clinical trials with that essential tremor trial, kind of as a background for that. So Michelle, I will go ahead and turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you, Mandy, and thank you, Dr. Mayo, again for that lovely introduction. And as Mandy said, we're so happy to be here today. We've been looking forward to this event. I did want to start briefly by just actually introducing Jazz a little bit more so that the audience on the line can sort of understand who's talking to them. So, just to tell you a little bit about Jazz, we are a global biopharmaceutical company. And we actually have offices in the US and Canada, and then outside the US, and several countries in Europe, and including Japan as well. And when we think about Jazz as a whole, we have a little bit more than 3,000 employees, and we are a diverse group of folks. We're analysts, specialists, scientists, medical doctors, patient advocate representatives. And with that, we can bring such a diverse set of backgrounds and perspectives to how we think about drug development and developing new medications. Jazz does focus on two key therapeutic areas, oncology and neuroscience. And both myself and Mandy are on the neuroscience side at Jazz. And with our neuroscience pipeline, we actually focus on several different therapeutic disorders. We have products in development for psychiatry, for epilepsy, for sleep disorders, and also for movement disorders. So both myself and Mandy have been working in the essential tremor space at Jazz for, I think, a little over 3 years now. And we've really gotten to know the space, and have had the privilege of meeting so many patients, and it's been such a wonderful experience to really sort of step into the essential tremor space and learn where the needs are and what Jazz can do to help. So with that, I'm going to start the first chapter of this presentation, which we thought it would be helpful to sort of start with a broad overview of drug development before diving into the specific study that we have ongoing in the essential tremor space. And the reason that we do this is because we feel like, it's really helpful for pharmaceutical companies to really educate the community around the process of drug development, because it should never be a black box, to the patient community. I mean, there should be transparency and understanding of how it actually works. So let me start by just giving this broad overview. This slide is really showing a visual schematic of what the overall process of drug development looks like. And if I start at the top, you can see that it's divided sort of into two sections, if you will. There's a drug discovery and preclinical phase. And anytime we use the word preclinical, that means before the drug actually is evaluated in humans. So preclinical means animal models, in vitro models, or studying it in cells and so forth. And then you can see the next phase is the clinical phase. And there are various components of the clinical phase. Usually what you see with drug development, when a drug first enters into a study in humans, we start in a healthy volunteer population. And that's because one of the key questions that we usually have is, what is the drug what is the body actually doing to the drug? So we need to understand what's called the pharmacokinetic profile of the drug. That is when an individual takes the drug, how is the body absorbing the drug, metabolizing the drug, distributing the drug? So we ask those basic sorts of questions before moving into a patient population. And you can see on the screen here that when we move into the patient population, that's usually what we call phase 2 or phase 3 of drug development. Now, if I back up a little bit into that drug discovery and preclinical phase, the important questions that we ask during that phase are mainly in the categories of toxicology, pharmacology, and translation. So with toxicology, we need to ask and evaluate some basic questions of whether the drug is actually safe to even proceed to those phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. On the pharmacology side, we can do several types of experiments to understand how and where the drug is working in the body. And when I say translation, there are several diseases that have really reliable animal models that can give us that preliminary understanding of, is the drug going to actually work in this condition? And then I'll maybe lastly say that during the clinical phase of drug development, we're always taking baby steps in science, and this is true also for drug development, where we need to do multiple studies to actually confirm that the drug is working and understand the safety profile of the drug. So as we're proceeding through clinical phases, and we start with that phase 2 study in the patient population, usually it's a smaller study of around 50 to 100 patients. And the questions that we ask are, is the drug actually working in this condition, and what is the safety profile? After we do that study and we get those answers, we then do another study. And we typically do that in a larger population of, let's say, 200 to 400 patients. And we ask the same questions. Is the drug working, and what is the safety profile? And then usually we do that again to confirm those questions. So there's a lot of baby stepping and sort of confirmatory studies that occur during drug development. And so Mandy, if I can maybe have you move to the next slide. So, now that I've sort of given you that picture of the overall drug development process, I do want to touch on, why are these studies even important to conduct? And I think that many of you have learned this by participating in the Diann Shaddox Foundation. But clinical research is really the heart of all medical and scientific advances. We need to do studies to understand diseases and conditions better. And the only way that we are ever going to develop new medications or innovations or therapies are to actually do well-controlled clinical studies. So before we even start on a clinical trial, we have to, at Jazz, gather all the information that we have about the drug. We have to develop research questions and objectives, and start those basic building blocks of what do the clinical studies, or how are they actually going to be designed? What are the questions that we're going to ask? How are we going to measure if the drug works? What's the sort of patient population that we're looking for? And we work, of course, with a number of people to sort of start on that roadmap. So the ultimate goal, Mandy, if I can have you go to the next slide, of drug development, of course, is to provide new medications to people. And of course, the sort of gold standard is that we would love to develop therapies that actually cure diseases. Now, I can tell you that many diseases in the neuroscience or neurology space are very complicated, meaning that there are multiple underlying mechanisms that contribute to those diseases. And I do think that one day we will have a cure for essential tremor. In the meantime, what we're working on are new medications to help with the symptomatic control of essential tremor. So I want to talk to you a little bit before transitioning to Mandy about when we go through the drug development phase. A question that we always get is, how is the FDA involved, or how do you interact with the FDA? And I'll say at the end of a development program, we put together all of our data and information, and we submit a package to the FDA to actually review all of the data. Now, of course, we're always working with the FDA along the way. But the slide that you're looking at now is highlighting what's called a new drug application, or the abbreviation that you often hear is NDA. And the NDA is actually what we give to the FDA so that they can evaluate whether a drug can be approved and marketed. And you can think of the NDA like a gigantic book. There are multiple chapters in an NDA, and it has all the information that the FDA needs to actually make that evaluation. So it has information on how the drug is manufactured, what the data were from that preclinical phase, all the data from the clinical phases. And then ultimately at the beginning of our large book is actually our proposed labeling for the drug, which is a really important document for any medication. The label, of course, specifies what the drug is actually approved and indicated for, and has all the information that a medical doctor needs to safely prescribe the medication to a patient. Mandy, if you go to the next slide, I have an old image here. You know, nowadays when we actually submit NDAs, we do this electronically. But, you know, 20 years ago or so, before electronic versions of NDAs, we actually had to submit paper versions of the NDA. And this is a picture to actually show you how large an NDA is. This is an actual reviewer at the FDA looking through an NDA. And I think that this sort of picture will maybe help explain why it takes the FDA so long to actually review a new drug application. You can just see the immense amount of data that they need to go through. So typically an FDA, once a company actually submits the NDA, typically the FDA needs about 10 months to actually review an NDA. And there's an entire FDA team consisting of, you know, medical doctors, pharmacologists, biostatisticians that are looking at every component of the data. And what they're asking, their main question during that review is, do the benefits of this new medication outweigh the risks? And that question, of course, has to be yes for them to approve a new medication. So the last part of this section, I want to talk just a little bit about, you know, what FDA actually really needs to make that evaluation. And what they need are well-designed clinical studies. So on the next slide, you know, what do I mean when I say well-designed? Well, if any of you have looked into participating into a clinical study or have talked to your medical doctor about a clinical study, you've probably heard terms or phrases like, well, this study has a placebo arm, or this study is a randomized controlled trial. You know, and what do those phrases mean? Well, those are all components of a well-designed study. So the reason that you see many clinical studies have a placebo group, you know, and placebo is basically a sugar pill almost. It's a drug that looks the same as the active drug that we're studying, but it doesn't have any of the ingredients of that active drug. And that placebo group serves as a control group for us because we need to understand what the true effects of of our actual drug are, from both the does it actually work and also from the safety perspective. Because in a placebo-controlled study, you'll see that side effects will happen in both the placebo group and in the drug group. And that helps us determine what type of side effects are actually attributed to the drug. When you hear words like randomized, this means that when a participant is interested in joining a clinical study, they're usually randomized to a treatment arm, meaning that they don't know if they're taking placebo or the active drug. We don't know if that person is taking the placebo or active drug. The clinical site and the medical doctor at that site don't know either. And all of that serves to remove any biases of knowing what treatment arm participants were randomized to. And then finally, whenever we embark on a clinical study, we always have to have the blueprints laid out for that study of how everything, every detail of that study is going to be done. And that's what we call the study protocol. And in addition to the protocol, we need to have what's called a statistical analysis plan to specify how we are actually going to analyze the data. So the FDA is very involved at the beginning of our clinical studies of reviewing those protocols, reviewing those statistical analysis plans, because at the end of the day, the FDA wants to help us develop medications and they want to see new drugs come to market. So we really form this partnership with the FDA along the drug development process. So in terms of the planning of a clinical study, Mandy, if I can have you go to the next slide. It really depends on the question that we're trying to ask. The key question is, is our clinical study actually being conducted in a healthy volunteer population? Is it being conducted in a patient population? And depending on the details of the study, each study will have its own specific primary objective or question. And we need to think about what that is in advance. It's not something that we do while the study is running. So the planning of our study always starts with what is the main question. And we have to translate that question into an objective that we can actually measure and that is clinically relevant. So you can see an example of that at the bottom of the screen here, where here's an example of an objective being written as, does drug X treat, the outcome of interest in people with, and we have to define who the population is that we're trying to target for that clinical study. Again, is it a healthy volunteer population? Is it an essential tremor population? And furthermore, if it's essential tremor patients, who are the specific type of patients that we're looking for? And then you can see the end of that question is, how are we actually going to measure whether the drug is working? What kind of scale or assessment or endpoint are we going to use? And for how long are we going to actually run this study for? So the planning of a clinical trial really does need to start with that question. And that's why we have a whole team of clinical research scientists, medical doctors, experts, outside experts helping us design what the clinical trial is going to look like. So just to touch a little bit on, how does Jazz actually do this? How do we actually conduct these clinical studies across our neuroscience pipeline? We can't do it without the partnerships that we have. I mean, both internally at Jazz, I mentioned that we have over 3,000 employees, and each clinical study that we're running has a huge clinical team that's working on that study that range from PhD scientists to medical doctors to data managers to biostatisticians and so forth. So we work with all sorts of experts along the way. And one of the most important experts that we work with are actually patients. So this is why we highly value these types of engagements, because we are constantly learning from patients. And by engaging with patients, by hearing their stories, by listening to descriptions of the diseases that they're living with, it helps us actually design our clinical studies better. So patients are one of our most important stakeholders, if you will, when we think about designing drug development programs. And the way that we interact with patients, there are several examples of this. So, here on the screen, you can see that we do this through interviews, through surveys. We sometimes run something called advisory boards, where we get a group of patients together and it gives us an opportunity to ask all sorts of questions to those patients. And then, of course, by partnering with advocacy groups like the Diann Shaddox Foundation, because those sorts of partnerships, again, really help us understand more what it's like to live with essential tremor and hearing patient stories and so forth. So I'm going to end with a slide that, highlights that the drug development process is certainly not easy, but there is hope and there is so much progress being made, particularly in the field of neuroscience. Our understanding of brain diseases continue to evolve. There's been sort of an explosion of research, I think, in the essential tremor space over the past 5 to 10 years that have really helped companies like Jazz identify drugs of interest to evaluate as potential new medications for essential tremor. And we all know that essential tremor is a disease that really could benefit from new medications. There hasn't been a new medication developed for essential tremor in about 40 to 50 years. So it's not an easy process. It's challenging. Some drugs can fail along the way, but the message here is that keep that hope, keep engaging with your patient community, keep engaging with pharmaceutical companies, to hear about the progress and innovation that's being made. And we certainly can't do this without you. So with that, I'm going to turn to Mandy, who's actually going to give more of an overview of the specific drug that we have in development for essential tremor. It has a code name, it's called JZP385. And she's going to talk to you more about the drug and also our ongoing phase 2B study. So with that, I'll hand it to you, Mandy.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for providing that really nice overview. I will, as Michelle mentioned, delve into a little more details about the drug that we are developing for essential tremor, and probably go back to some of Michelle's key points about our clinical trial and why we've designed it the way we have done. So I will start with an overview of JZP385 and really why we chose to develop this molecule for essential tremor. I think most people who are on this call already know that essential tremor is extremely common, and it's a chronic neurological disorder, and its impacts can be profound on people who are living with essential tremor, and can have debilitating consequences on abilities to complete activities of daily living. So unfortunately, we don't yet fully understand the mechanism that causes essential tremor. But as Michelle mentioned, some really excellent research has been done over the past approximate decade or so that has been able to identify abnormal rhythms in certain regions of the brain that contribute to ET, and really identify certain regions that play a role in essential tremor. And there has been, on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a picture of really some of these key regions in the brain that contribute to what is now called a tremor network that has been identified as being critical to causing some of the oscillations seen with essential tremor. This has been extremely important when it comes to drug development, because without this information, we don't really have a target of which to develop a drug for. We don't know what we're targeting. That's probably why you haven't seen much new in the past about 50 years. And all of the existing medications for essential tremor have not been developed to actually treat essential tremor. They were developed for a different purpose originally, and have been found to have utility in improving tremor symptoms. But this research has really paved a way for identification of pharmacological targets that we have really good confidence can actually improve tremor symptoms in a way that is potentially better than currently existing treatments. And so there's this new generation of drug development programs for essential tremor. We at Jazz have a molecule that is targeting one of these targets, the T-type calcium channel. But we're not the only ones. There are other pharmaceutical companies right now also conducting clinical trials targeting other receptors that have been identified to be potentially important for controlling tremor symptoms. So I think, as Michelle mentioned, it's an exciting time. I think we're going to see some new medicines on the horizon. and hope that at least the medicine we have, JZP-385, is going to be one of those. So I'll talk a little bit about that. JZP-385 does act on T-type calcium channels. These T-type calcium channels are found throughout the tremor network, so throughout these regions shown in the picture on the right-hand side of the slide. And they're thought to be important for controlling normal motor movement. We do have some exciting evidence from a phase 2A clinical study, so a study conducted in people with essential tremor. This is called the TCOM study. And in that study, there were 95 people with essential tremor enrolled, and JZP-385 was found to have some improvements on activities of daily living and different measures of efficacy assessments, as we call them. And also it seemed to have a good safety profile, enough so that we've decided to continue to advance this drug throughout that clinical process. So I think we'll go into where is JZP-385. I'm going to bring back the schematic Michelle showed earlier and mention that we did complete a phase 2A study. And now we are going on to a phase 2B study, as we're calling it, so a little further in phase 2, right before a phase 3 study. This is, we've termed what's called the Everest Study, and it's an ongoing study. I want to talk a little bit more about this study on the subsequent slides, but I'm showing a picture of our website, so you can actually find some more details about this study on our website, which is www.evereststudy.com. We'll provide this for anyone who's listening after the fact, so no need to write this down. But I wanted to talk within the context of telling you about this study. I wanted to talk about, and educate a little bit about why we designed it in the way that we did. And so I'll be telling the story from that lens. And I think Michelle has already mentioned how closely we work with the FDA throughout this process from the very beginning. But I want to highlight that we work with a lot of people as we're developing trials, as we're developing our entire program, and it really does take a village. And I want to reemphasize what Michelle says, that I think a lot of people are not as aware how much we work with patients throughout this process. So people living with essential tremor are, as Michelle said, one of our key stakeholders. And we need to make sure when we're developing a drug that it's going to be a drug that targets symptoms that are really problematic for people who are living with essential tremor. And so that's why it's so important that, that we're engaging with you throughout this process. But beyond that, there are a lot of people that we work with, including physicians who end up prescribing this medication, caregivers, and other researchers and others within the scientific community. I also want to loop back to the objective of this study and really use what Michelle mentioned as our key question and start to fill in those gaps, at least for the Everest study. So our key objective for this study was we're really interested in understanding if our drug, JZP-385, at different doses, so we're going to be testing different doses of this drug, is effective in treating tremor in people who have moderate to severe essential tremor. So that's the population that we're interested in, moderate to severe essential tremor. And we will do that by using tremor rating scales to measure that tremor over a duration of 12 weeks. So let's look a little bit more at the study design. So this is the design of our Everest study. As I mentioned, we're looking at 3 different doses of this medication, and we are comparing it to placebo. So the placebos are our control group here. And participants who enroll in this study will receive either a placebo pill for 12 weeks, or they'll receive one of 3 different doses of JZP-385. It is a double-blind study, so no one knows what treatment they're receiving, not the participant or the doctor at the study site, or us at Jazz know what you'll receive. And we only unblind, as we call it, or get to see who got what at the very end of the entire study. So it's not after a single participant completes, it's after all of our participants complete the entire study that then we reveal who got what, and then we can do our analyses. So this is actually a very large study. We're looking to enroll 400 participants with essential tremor. And participants will be randomized into each of these treatment arms in an equal ratio. So that means 100 of those patients will get placebo, 100 on 10 milligrams, et cetera. And so just a couple other points I want to make on this. There are, pros and cons as we thought about the design for this study. And there are pros and cons with all study designs. I think from our perspective, the advantages of this study design, really one of our key objectives, as mentioned previously, is to look at different doses and see if they're effective. So we needed a control group to help, compare our drug to a control group. So placebo is our chosen group. And we're also very interested in what dose is best from both the balance of safety and efficacy. So this parallel design study really hit those key objectives. There are some cons, of course. I think the key one being that it results in a longer time on placebo for the participants who are randomized to the placebo group. Okay, so now I want to move into how we decided to measure tremor in this study and what we call our primary endpoint. So our target symptom, I think, is a pretty easy question or was pretty easy to define in this patient population, because essential tremor is characterized by an action tremor in the upper limbs or the hands and arms. So, we were looking to measure action tremor. Historically, this has been done by measuring tremor amplitude. So I'm sure many of you living with essential tremor have been to your doctor and they've had you put your hands and arms in certain positions so that they could see, the amplitude of that tremor. And there are many ways that this has previously been measured in research, and it's often done by looking at how many centimeters is that tremor amplitude. So when we look to understand how to best measure this tremor, that's where it started. However, it was really our partnerships and our engagements with our key stakeholders that kind of turned us away from measuring tremor amplitude as the primary measurement. I love this quote by Dr. Janet Woodcock at the FDA, who said, "It turns out what is really bothering the patient and what is bothering the doctor or others in the patient's lives can be radically different things, and patients are truly experts at their disease." So it was through that patient work that we did that we found that for many, it wasn't the amplitude of the tremor that was important. It was how the tremor impacts their ability to do what they want to do. And sometimes those align really well. Sometimes a higher amplitude tremor does lead to more impact on activities of daily living, but sometimes that's not always true. And that can differ based on what's important to an individual patient. And it can differ also just based on the clinical characteristics of the patients, where a higher tremor amplitude might actually not correspond to more difficulty doing things such as drinking from a cup. So because of this work, we moved away from measuring tremor amplitude as our key measurement, and we wanted to focus on something that measures disability due to tremor. So we had to now select a scale or a measurement that we can use consistently across all of the participants in the study to measure this in a consistent way. And so we had to choose, when we were looking at how to measure this, we usually pick a clinical assessment or a scale that is hopefully well validated. Sometimes it's objective, sometimes it's subjective. It's something we look to consider, but there's not always one thing that's better than another from that perspective. It's just a consideration. We have to pick something that's responsive to drug treatment, because if whatever we choose is not sensitive enough to detect the effects of a drug, we could have what we call a negative study, or a study that doesn't show a treatment is effective, but in reality, it could be effective in the clinic. So this is a key consideration. We want to just make sure that whatever we choose is sensitive enough to detect an improvement with a drug. And we also look at burden. If all else is equal with scales, we do want to go with something that is the least burdensome to participants who are in the study. So for the primary endpoint in this study, we actually selected items from a validated tremor rating scale called the TETRAS. We selected items that measured the impact of tremor on activities of daily living, again, based on a lot of the work and background we did with our key stakeholders about what is important to patients. So we're measuring things like speaking, feeding with a spoon, drinking from a glass, etc. And these are a little bit more subjective questions, and patients answer these questions and the impact of their tremor on these activities. However, we did also add in two more objective components into this endpoint, and they were performance assessments. So the ability to draw what is called an Archimedes spiral, as well as the ability to do handwriting or writing samples. So all of these items are combined to form our primary endpoint in this study. Now, we measure a lot of other things in studies, and we have different what we call secondary and exploratory endpoints, both from an efficacy perspective as well as from a safety and tolerability perspective. So in this phase 2b Everest study, we have additional efficacy endpoints focused on how clinicians think patients are doing on the treatment, as well as how patients think they're doing on the treatment. We also have assessments to assess embarrassment due to essential tremor and quality of life more generally. And then we have a battery of safety and tolerability assessments that we conduct at all of the clinic visits, things such as physical exams, heart rate, blood pressure measurements, ECGs, and routine laboratory assessments. And finally, we continue. Michelle mentioned that early on in our drug development, we typically are interested in what happens, what the body does to the drug. Well, we continue to be interested in that even in later stages. So we do continue to measure that pharmacokinetic effect and are doing that in this study. Okay, so I'm going to move to talk a little bit about our study population in the study, or what we call the eligibility criteria. So we have to define, who we want to enroll in this study prospectively. So as I mentioned earlier, our target population is adults with moderate to severe essential tremor. Again, we've focused on more moderate to severe essential tremor because that's what we've heard usually has the most functional impact on people who are living with essential tremor. And a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people with mild essential tremor are not always looking to treat that tremor at that stage yet, because the impact isn't always severe enough to warrant treatment with a medicine. So we wanted to focus on more moderate to severe essential tremor. We have key inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria to help define that patient population. So we are looking for adults between the ages of 18 to 80 who are diagnosed with essential tremor and have moderate to severe disability associated with that tremor. Now, we do have to exclude certain other factors to really help us from a perspective of one, we want to make sure that we are enrolling as representative a patient population as possible, but two, we also want to make sure that we are not going to enroll participants who might have other conditions where our drug might have different effects on those conditions, both from an efficacy and safety perspective. So we're trying to keep it a homogeneous patient population as possible. So we do exclude other conditions that might actually cause or explain the tremor, such as Parkinson's disease or dystonia. And we also exclude other treatments for essential tremor, both surgical and medications, again, with the idea that we're trying to minimize bias and we're trying to really understand the effect of JZP-385 on tremor as well as on the body. So where are we doing this study? Well, I'm showing a map of our currently active sites in the US. We actually are conducting this study in sites in Europe as well, in Spain, Poland, and Germany. But we do have several, we have currently 29 active sites in the US, which are located by, or visualized by pins on this map. There's a lot of things we consider when we select these sites. They have to be able to conduct the assessments that we have in our protocols. And we also are interested in areas and sites that actually see people who are living with essential tremor. So there's a lot of background work that goes into how we selected sites and the locations in which these sites are selected in. But I'm going to move, I think, the last few minutes before we get into some of the questions. I want to just talk a little bit more about participating in clinical trials. And I don't think I can overemphasize enough how important it is that we have participants in our trials, because these trials can often take 2 or 3 years to actually conduct, especially large ones like this one, which is 400 participants. And the only way we can go faster and get medicines approved more quickly is by having people willing to participate in these studies that can really speed up that process. And we recognize that the participation in these studies isn't always easy, and it requires a lot of dedication from the participants. So we recognize and value that that's the case. And to that regard, we wanted to talk a little bit about how you can participate in studies if you're interested in them, not just our own Everest study, but other studies you might be interested in as well. And I think I'll start by, how do I find a trial? You would think that might be easy. It's not always easy. And it's, I wanted to provide a few tools to help you if you're looking to participate in a clinical trial. I think some of the key things you can do is ask your doctor. Often they're aware of trials that you would be eligible for. So that's a really good first step. And support groups and engagements and foundations such as the Diann Shaddox Foundation, learning about trials like the one we're doing at Jazz. That's another key place you can get good information. Keep your eye out for advertisements. Trials often advertise in doctors' offices, so that's a good place to look. And then, unfortunately, if you're not finding anything, coming to you through the communities you're engaged in, you can go and proactively search for trials. I've put links on probably 2 of the best websites to find trials, as we do have to post all clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, for instance. So you'll always find active trials there. And showed a screenshot. I think this website, you can make really good use of some of the advanced search and toolbar options, not only to find trials, but also find trials with sites physically near where you live, because that's another important part if you're looking to participate. So when you go to advanced search here, you can actually put in locations and cities and zip codes, for instance, and then use your search for the condition or disease that you or a loved one maybe has, and also refine your search by other terms. And that can really narrow down the number of trials that are actively recruiting and that you might be able to participate in. I've also shown a screenshot of once if you do this search and you can click on a trial, if you scroll down to the bottom, that's where you'll usually find the context and location. So this is a screenshot of our own study. This was actually a couple months ago when we had fewer study locations activated. But if you were to expand this, it'll actually show you where the study locations are. On that note, I would also encourage you to refresh and come back to trials. If you're interested in a trial but you don't see a location near you, this often gets updated. And as new study sites get activated, because they don't all start at the same time. Some sites start earlier than others. So I would very much encourage you to look back if there's a trial you're interested in, but there's not a location currently open near you. And, I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the final slides, but I will just stop here to emphasize that we put safety of our participants as a top priority, not just we in pharmaceutical companies, but all of the stakeholders involved in the clinical trial process. And I think this slide shows them what I wanted to show here is really the multitude of different different people and different groups that oversee safety of participants in clinical trials. And they do so at various points at the beginning of writing the study protocol, during the study, so continuing monitoring of individual participants, as well as in some cases, the data as a whole as they're coming in, to make sure that it continues to be safe for people to participate in this study. And then there are actions that are taken if that, if that answer to does it continue to be safe to continue the study is no. There are things that will be done, such as studies may stop enrolling, and there may be holds on studies to investigate potential safety issues. So I just wanted to provide that context that safety continues to be a top priority in clinical trials. And I think I will skip over to just end here so we can get to a few of the questions. And we'll definitely be sharing these slides, so there are additional links with information if you're interested in learning more. And I'll stop here now and thank everybody for their time. And Dr. Mayo, I'm not sure if we want to start with live questions or go ahead and get into some of the questions that were pre-submitted.
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sturkle and Dr. Bellotti, for that really wonderful and very thorough presentation. I think it's wonderful that you actually went over even the process of what is a clinical trial and the steps leading up to that, because I think a lot of times folks don't realize that. If you don't mind, I just want to highlight a couple of things to our viewers and our listeners today. So, it's a lot of information. So, this clinical trial, folks, it is a medication-based trial, and the way that it is outlined, it is randomized. So you don't know if you will be placebo or if you will have the treatment. However, in this trial, oftentimes that's a 50-50 split, right? But it is not the case in this trial because there's 3 different doses for the medication. So there's actually a 3 out of 4 chance that you will be randomized to one of the treatment arms, because I know personally in talking to patients, a lot of times they're concerned, oh, well, what if I'm unlucky, right? And get the placebo. So I just wanted to highlight that for folks, because I think that definitely is it's a benefit from my standpoint, right? So I wanted to highlight that point. I did have a question that I'm sure others do. Obviously, this is a phase 2B trial. So you've completed, a smaller arm. Are you at liberty to either share any of the results from phase 2A, or if not, could you speak to the general principle of advancing to a phase 2B in light of results from a phase 2A? That would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. Mandy, I'm happy to start and can pass it to you.
Sure. I'll fill in. Yeah.
But I'll just say, that's a great question. And the phase 2A results, it's the study called TCALM that Mandy touched on. It's actually published, and we've also shared results at various scientific conferences. So the results are certainly available in the public domain. That was a really important study for us, to determine whether we wanted to continue development of JZP-385. And it also really helped guide us in designing the phase 2B study, because, I mentioned at the beginning that science is like baby steps, and we are constantly learning along the way. So we took the learnings from the phase 2A study, which showed that JZP-385 had compelling effects on reducing the functional impairment due to tremor on the same tremor rating scales that we're using in the phase 2B study. And we used the results of that to really sort of optimize the design of the phase 2B study of okay, what can we do better with the next design, and what can we advance in our knowledge? So, that phase 2A study was a relatively short duration study. It was 4 weeks, and one of the big questions, of course, is, okay, well, if we do a longer study, do we still see that the drug works, or, do the effects go away over time? And furthermore, one of course, the key advances that we're making in the phase 2b study is to evaluate various doses of JZP-385, because we really need to understand where that therapeutic dose range is. But Mandy, if you want to add anything else to that.
Just to echo what Michelle said, several of the endpoints that we are looking at in our phase 2b study, or ongoing phase 2b study, were selected because they did actually demonstrate improvement in that TCALM study. So all of those things I went over, we did see in the phase 2a that there seemed to be an improvement with JZP-385 compared with placebo, and that phase 2a was also a placebo-controlled trial as well.
Okay. All right, thank you so much. I just think that's important. A lot of times I think patients are a little hesitant to be the first ones to test something out. So I think emphasizing that is very key for folks to be able to make an educated decision about that. All right, well, we can go to, I don't see any questions in our Zoom chat right now. Cher or Diann, are you able to check in the Facebook group and see maybe if there's questions there? And then we can, while you're doing that, maybe we can just go to the pre-submitted questions and just take those in a roundtable discussion. So let me first pull up the ones that are very relevant. So I believe you answered this in your presentation, but there was one question that came in, whether there was a clinical trial for this particular agent in Canada. So
yeah, and I'll just say that at the moment, this phase 2b trial is not being conducted in Canada. Okay. It's possible, as we hope to do future studies after this one, and usually as we get into larger and larger studies, we expand them into more and more countries. So it's possible that a future trial might be opened in Canada.
Okay, and then along those lines, I'll ask just a follow-up question that I hear quite a bit. If you're in Canada, perhaps, and you wanted to come to the US and participate in one of the centers here, is that a possibility, or is that not a possibility? If you could speak to that.
I would say it would typically depend. I mean, we in our current 12-week study, we have either 7 to 8 clinic visits, and so over a period of 12 weeks, it wouldn't be impossible to be flying in for those. Theoretically, that could be done, but typically that's not done because of the frequency of visits. So I would say there's nothing restricting it, but geographically you would probably want to be near a site. So if you happen to be on a border and there's a border site, that might be a possibility, but just keep that in mind. You would probably want to be within a couple hours of the site.
Okay, thank you very much.
But we do actually, within that, I failed to mention, we do for everyone, even near sites, each of our sites are contracted to be able to provide travel assistance and services. And in some cases, that does include overnight visits for people who are coming from further away. So that type of expense is usually covered as part of your participation in the study.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And I did notice you have a couple sites, at least in the Northwest. So I don't know what part of Canada this person was from, but if you're on the western side of Canada, that might be a possibility as well. All right, there's a question that I think is very germane to one of your exclusionary criteria. So a question came in: can someone have essential tremor and Parkinson's? They said they were diagnosed with essential tremor earlier this year. Now they see signs of Parkinson's too. So I will, from a clinical standpoint, actually, there's been some recent studies regarding this. It was something we had noticed for years and years and years, but actually has been formally studied. And there is quite a bit of crossover actually between ET and Parkinson's disease. And sometimes we see that as soon as within 2 years of the initial diagnosis. So to answer the question, yes, there is crossover. There's also a lot of symptoms that are common to both conditions as well. So balance issues, depression, and some other symptoms as well. And there can be some diagnostic issues. I want to ask Jazz, our ladies here, how long, I did not see this in the inclusion criteria, how long have they had to have had a diagnosis of essential tremor for them to qualify for the study? Is there anything along those lines in there?
Yeah, so there's no minimum time for the diagnosis, but we do define the diagnosis of essential tremor by the recent movement disorder classification requirement, which does require symptoms to have been present for 3 years in order to get that diagnosis. So I'll just separate it by saying that the diagnosis, you could have been diagnosed a week before participating, but as part of the diagnosis, you had to have had essential tremor symptoms for 3 years without any, as Dr. Mayo said, any other observing symptoms that might indicate a different disorder during that time.
Okay, wonderful. And we had a number of questions asking about, are there any new medications for severe head and neck tremors? I believe we have answered that. It's been about 40 to 50 years since we've had anything new. And this is, if that is something you're interested in pursuing, I encourage you to reach out to your doctor to ask more about this clinical trial, or you can check out the information on the website, which I've looked at and is very, very comprehensive as well. Now, I did notice in your exclusion criteria, no one can be on one of those other medications at the time of the trial. What is the washout period? So what is the time they have to be off of those meds before they could participate in your trial?
So the washout period will differ based on the medication that you're on. Usually, so we need to make sure that the medication is completely out of your body prior to you starting on JZP-385. And the time it takes for that to happen is going to be different based on the medications. So some medications stay in your body for longer than others. So I don't have an exact answer because it will depend on the medication. I will briefly say that I think the two most common medications people would be on are propranolol and primidone. And propranolol has a very short half-life. What that means is it does clear from your body much more quickly. And so the washout period for propranolol is not going to be very long. Primidone is different. Primidone has a very long half-life. And so primidone washout is going to be several weeks prior to participating in our study. You would have had to have been off of primidone for actually in our study 4 weeks prior to receiving JZP-385.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And then there are many other medications where it's different.
Of course. Yeah, I think you hit the two most common ones. And I do want to encourage people, though, just because you're on primidone and you hear there's this 4-week period you have to be off, it takes some time between making the initial inquiry and actually getting approved for the clinical trial. So I encourage you, if you're interested, go ahead and pursue the application process, because, then you can make a determination with your doctor what is the best way for you to move forward. And
can I actually just add one more quick comment on that? As soon as you're finished participating in the study, you can go straight back to the medications you were on. So this is only a temporary, if we're on something but wanting to participate in research, it's only a temporary, discontinuation.
Okay, wonderful. And let's see, I know we had another question. Oh, so you had mentioned you cannot have had DBS, deep brain stimulation. You cannot have had focused ultrasound treatment or radiofrequency ablation, any other surgical treatment. As you know, there are many new devices externally applied. For example, one of those is the Calitrio, which we had a number of questions about. I'll take in just a moment, but just to assuage anyone's concerns regarding that, if they're using Calitrio, is that something that they could continue to use during the trial, or they would have to stop using it during the trial? If you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, so they would have to stop using the Calitrio or any other device for the same reasons we're excluding. We're really looking to minimize bias for anything else which might be improving tremor. So that is excluded.
Okay. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and take this question regarding that particular device. So they often, as physicians, we prescribe that device for the dominant hand, even if the non-dominant hand has worse degree of tremor. And the question that came in regarding the Calitrio device was, can you switch hands? Because they are obviously using it on their dominant hand, but they're much more bothered, and I believe noticing more the symptoms on the opposite hand. And obviously I don't work in detail with this device, but from what I understand, it provides stimulation for both the radial nerve and the median nerve, and those are located obviously differently on each hand. So you would not be able to just switch it, and they are modified for the particular degree of tremor. So that is something that you would not be able to just take it off and put it on the other side. And it would not be a straightforward process to do that. And I believe at the moment, the indication right now is for dominant sided tremor. So that's something definitely speak to your physician about, but it's not something to just try to do yourself. So. All right, let me see what other questions we have here. Okay, well, there is a question from a person who says, what treatment is there for a 73-year-old with comorbidities and no way to travel to major ET therapy sites? So very interesting question. So obviously a lot of the times we recommend that evaluation at a movement disorder center, which they are not in a lot of different places. However, let me ask you to this. So let's say someone has not been formally evaluated at a major movement disorder center, but they have, they have a TETRAS score and they have been evaluated by their neurologist. Would they be appropriate for your clinical trial if there is a location in their area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so most of our sites are, and many of our sites are actually movement disorder specialists also. So that diagnosis can be made sometimes at the site, depending what the site is. So yes, that participant would be eligible. They would need to have a diagnosis of ET according to our criteria, but if they don't, if they have the symptoms and they're otherwise, can be evaluated by the site for that diagnosis, yes, that can be a possibility as well to enroll in the study.
Okay, thank you very much. And just to follow up onto that, there's a number of treatments. Of course, when you're considering any kind of surgical intervention or clinical trials, obviously you do want to be evaluated more at a movement disorder specialist center. However, there's a number of, the approved medications that are already out there that your general neurologist or perhaps even your family practitioner can prescribe. There's also a number of more natural treatments as well that you can pursue. So there's many choices for you.
Okay. I have one thing.
Yes.
This is so simple, but a lot of people have asked me, is there any way to do this clinical trial through like a Zoom online, or do you really physically have to be there at one of your clinical places?
Yeah, that's not a simple question. That's a great question. And I can tell you at Jazz, we are really interested in sort of moving to that space more. So that the term that you often hear for that is something called decentralized trials, where, a lot of the clinical assessments can be done remotely. I think especially the COVID pandemic has sort of accelerated the enthusiasm around that, because, even with going to see just your normal family doctor, or sometimes with, even if you're seeing a movement disorder specialist, they can do assessments over Zoom. One thing that does make it a little challenging, at least, which isn't, a showstopper for us, but sometimes there isn't that substitute of, a clinician being in the same room with the patient to do safety assessments, to be able, to take blood. When we think about tremor, sometimes there are complications with observing tremor over a camera. versus, when the clinician is actually in the room with the patient. So it's something that we're having, heavy discussions in, not only at Jazz, but I can tell you the entire pharma community, is interested in this, because ultimately it makes it less burdensome for patients to participate in clinical studies. And that's what we want from, those types of initiatives. We want to make it easier for participants to be able to join clinical studies. So, stay tuned for that, because I do think it's coming in the future.
That sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
It does, because even if you have little sites where other doctors, it's not a full clinic, can do the Zoom with you guys through their personal movement disorder, because people with ET, that is part of our problem, is getting out and going to different, new things and seeing to things. It causes a lot more stress. So you guys just keep working.
Wonderful, wonderful. Diann, did you have any other questions you wanted to pose before we go back to our?
I can't think of anything.
Okay. Nope. Okay, I think we just have a couple more coming, and many of the questions were posed were, please tell us what is new, and I think we have very well answered that today. There was a question about our essential tremor and dystonia related. So a lot of times you can see similar symptoms, but dystonia really is it's more of a kind of jerking movement rather than an action tremor. So you can get a dystonic tremor as well. Unfortunately, the mechanisms for dystonia and ET are not known very, very well at all. So they're not per se related, although you can see some crossover, and some of the treatments can be applied in both cases. Obviously, for this clinical trial here that Jazz, you are speaking about, is specifically for those diagnosed with ET and without dystonia. So I just want to clarify that as well.
Right.
Darlene, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I would like to know, once you get approval from the FDA, how long does it take before the medication would actually reach the market? And then also, how long does it take from the time it reaches the market before you're able to convince insurance companies this is something they need to cover?
That's a great question. Yeah, usually from the day that the FDA approves a medication to when do you see it, like in your local pharmacy, is usually about 2 to 3 months. So that's, what we sort of call the initial launch of the drug. And then in terms of insurance coverage, so that usually happens in the same time period that pharma companies are having those conversations with insurance payer groups, in that period of, following FDA approval. And it's conversations that we continue having, as we're launching the drug. I'll say that when we use that phrase launch, it's not just a one-time, one and done thing. Usually when you're launching a new drug, it can be like a 1 to 2 year process of actually, launching throughout the region that the drug was approved in. So, to give one more sort of complicated example outside of the US, when we get a drug approved in Europe, and we start launching in Europe, it's not that like every single country in Europe automatically has the drug all at the same time.
Gotcha.
It usually goes in phases of, in the first few months, you'll see that drug available in countries like, France or, Spain. And then, a few months later, you'll see the drug available in other regions. So that launch is certainly a process that happens, but to simply answer your question, it's usually like, 2 months after approval that you start seeing it available in pharmacies.
But in the US, I would think once you get FDA approval, that covers the whole United States, correct?
That's correct.
Europe, where you're dealing with different countries.
Yeah, and in Europe, once you get approval from the equivalent of the FDA in Europe, it means you have approval in all the EU countries.
Oh,
You know, because the UK recently separated from the EU, there's sort of a separate process now you have to go through to get, you know, approval
right,
specifically in the UK.
right. Now, do you have to go through for separate approvals in Canada as well, right? We have a lot of members that are in Australia and Canada.
Mhm. Yeah, in Canada, we also work with, you know, the equivalent of the FDA in Canada. And once you receive Canada or approval in Canada, it's broad approval in Canada. Now that doesn't mean, you know, Australia. You do have to go through a separate process with that country.
Okay.
And I will just add too, I'm glad to know the approval process is that quick. That actually surprises me. But I will tell you that getting the information in the hands of the frontline doctors who will be prescribing it, that is an entirely different issue. And so a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of education that must be done. So you can see a little bit longer of a lag. For example, when there's a, you know, a national convention for the neurologists, right, or the neurosurgeons or general practitioners, right, then they will be talking about some of these newly approved medications. So you may, if you, for example, participate in this clinical trial, or you've heard about it here, and maybe you don't participate in the trial, but once it's approved, you want to test out the medication, you may have to bring that up with your physician, right? So don't be afraid to do that too. So, you know, most physicians are open to learning about something new, but don't be surprised if they don't know it just because it is FDA approved. It tends to, that information tends to not always get in the hands of the prescribers that quickly.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought of one more question that's kind of different. Since so many people are not aware of what essential tremor is, what kind of media blitzing is going to be done, like with a Dupixent or a Humira or, you know, all these other medications? How difficult is it going to be to let people know what this medication is for when a lot of them don't even know what essential tremor is?
Yeah, that's a great question, Cher. I mean, typically with pharma companies, you know, when they embark on developing a new medication for condition X, I mean, in this case, essential tremor, we will be doing things along the way to raise the disease awareness, because we have learned at Jazz that even though essential tremor is the most common movement disorder, it is fascinating to us how under-recognized it is. And
yes.
And, you know, there's underdiagnoses, there's misdiagnoses. You know, we certainly will talk to clinicians who acknowledge that, you know, not every neurologist is very familiar with essential tremor.
Very few, actually.
So, you know, typically pharma companies and Jazz included will make a lot of effort to have what we call disease awareness campaigns. And it really, I think, ultimately benefits the medical and patient community to, you know, have pharma companies who have the resources and capabilities to really elevate the awareness of that disease. You know, it's, you can see, for example, with Parkinson's disease, that it really was when someone like Michael J. Fox was diagnosed with Parkinson's, it's like the awareness for Parkinson's exploded. And I think, you know, we want to see that happen for essential tremor, because we hear the frustrations and challenges from patients about, you know, not getting the attention that they are hoping to, not, you know, finding medical doctors that are as familiar with essential tremor as they're hoping to, and not sort of having their voices amplified. So we do everything that we can to sort of amplify that patient voice.
I think that's wonderful.
We can only hope.
Yes, we will look forward to that media campaign, certainly. There was another question directed to Jazz, so let me read it in its entirety. From what I've read of ETers' experiences with medications to reduce tremors, it's usually hit or miss with positive effects, and it seems very idiosyncratic. The medication works for some fraction of ETers, but not for others, and may well have negative side effects. How will what Jazz is developing assure widespread effectiveness with minimal side effects? And I know you answered a good bit of that in your presentation, but maybe if you could just kind of hit the high points with that as
Yeah.
it would be great.
Yeah, and I will first say that we, of course, would always advise anyone listening to always consult with your medical doctor to find the most appropriate treatment for you. But we do hope that from our presentation today that you have learned a little bit about the overall drug development process and more information, of course, on JZP-385. And one of the key reasons that clinical studies are conducted, we mentioned this during the presentation, is to understand that clinical profile of the drug. Does it work in a broad population? What is the safety profile? How can that safety profile be best managed? So, I'll say to all of you, remember that all medications, including placebo, have side effects. But, the goal of developing new medications is to have that positive benefit risk profile. And again, when we say that, we mean that do the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks?
Right.
So, you should always consult with your medical doctor to understand the benefits and risks of medications to determine if it's the right treatment for you.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. All right, just two more questions that came in. We'll address those quickly. There was one question that asked, is there any recourse for post-DBS speech issues? I will speak to that because that's my area of expertise. So what we found a lot of times is that the programming can be adjusted to avoid speech issues, and especially with some of the new systems, there can actually be a setting for improved hand tremor, and then a setting that will help you if you're going to talk on the phone, for example, and if you're having any speech issues. So also some of the new leads that are directionally modified, so it can provide stimulation in one direction but not another. There are fewer issues with that. In some rare cases, the lead could potentially need to be moved, but hopefully that testing is usually done in the operating room, so we can diagnose that earlier. So hopefully it doesn't have to move to that, but a lot of time the programming and the directional leads can be very, very helpful with that. There's one other question. Okay, there was a question about, does ET interact with TMJ or Eustachian tube dysfunction? I am not aware of any relation between those conditions at all. So I would have to say no, unless there's some research out there I'm not aware of. So, okay, I think that was, Cher, I noticed you had put, I don't think we addressed this, your last comment in the chat.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about that because I think that is very important. Do the trial participants continue to receive treatment after the trial, especially if it helps? And what about those who have been on the placebo arm? So could you address that, please, ladies?
Yeah, that's another great question. So, at this time, actually, let me back up and say that for most development programs, when you get to that phase 3 stage, what you will typically see with companies is they have what's called a long-term open label study that's running in the background to that randomized placebo-controlled phase 3 study. And what I mean when I say open label is it's a long-term study that's main objective is to understand the long-term safety of that drug that's under evaluation. And it's open label, meaning that everyone who joins the study gets active drug, and it's not, randomized or blinded in any way. Usually how those studies are designed is that anyone that's participating in those randomized placebo-controlled studies, once that portion is over, they have the opportunity to go into that long-term open label study.
Great.
You know, which is a great benefit, I think, for trial participants, because it gives you about a year access to the drug. You know that you're taking it, you know that you're not randomized to placebo, for example. And it gives us really, valuable information on the long-term effects, not only the safety, but also, is the drug continuing to work when someone's taking it for, longer than 12 weeks.
Right.
So we don't have that study currently running, but knock on wood that our phase 2b study is successful. The plan would be to have that type of study in the phase 3 program. And, the design of that study is that anyone who participates even now in our phase 2b study would have the opportunity to enroll in the future into that long-term study.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear, because there'd be nothing worse than finding something that helps you and then go, no, now you can't get it.
Yeah, we certainly hear that a lot. That's a frustration from trial participants.
Well, you've got a bunch of anxious people that anyway, anxiety and ET just kind of are married to each other, and then to tell them they can't have their medication when it was helping. Oh my goodness.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Well, I believe that completes our questions that came in advance,
Yeah.
and then those that have come in the chat. So we will, if you are on the Zoom, please do stay on. But for everyone in the Facebook group, we are going to stop recording momentarily and streaming to you. So I would love to thank Dr. Sturkle and Dr. Belatti for joining us today. Diann, as always, thank you for hosting this. And we look forward to the next ET Talks. Diann, do we have a date yet, or we're going to let folks know about that?
We're gonna let everybody know. We'll work on it, and thank Michelle and Mandy and Jazz for,
Yes.
informing us for this, the information. Everybody with ET, we're sitting here, as Cher said, waiting and anxious to get something to really help. And so we appreciate your time and the effort you're doing for ET.
Yeah,
And your
And thank
simple
you,
explanation.
everybody.
Yeah.
yeah, this was so much fun, and we can't say thank you enough for hosting us. I mean, we mentioned it before, but we get so much inspiration from engaging with the patient community, and we always take that back to Jazz, to the teams. I mean, it's why we're all working so hard. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And to let you know real quick, Cher and I both have had ET for many, many years. So
17.
we do appreciate Mine's 40 something diagnosed, and probably my entire life. So we
Yeah,
thank you for what you're doing.
very much.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Maybe in our
Thank you.
lifetime, Diann.
Let's hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. All right.
You
well,
both look young enough to me. So
Oh,
I would say
absolutely.
yes.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, we will see you next time. So take care.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.